It's November 30th, 2020. This is Roqe. Well, it was in November of last year that massive protests spread across Iran in what would become the loudest and ultimately most bloody street actions since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Iranians from all walks of life, fed up with an oppressive environment and deep economic crisis, began rising up to challenge the regime in ways that were more vocal, more pointed than before. Then, security forces responded with unprecedented brutality, killing some 1,500 citizens involved in the protests. 1 year later, we assess the context, the details, and the lessons of Bloody November. Plus, Mona from Melbourne joins us with the Persian proverb of the week. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. This is Roqe. Hi there, welcome to episode number 66 of Roqe. امیدوار هستم که میزون باشین. Hope you are doing all right wherever you are around the world listening to us. We are on this ongoing mission to build a new audio-visual encyclopedia of Iranian diaspora identity. We are coming to you on Spotify, on iTunes, SoundCloud, Instagram, YouTube, and Telegram. So in a few minutes, we're going to get to Nazanin Ansari, the managing editor at Kayhan London and Kayhan Life, to talk about Bloody November 2019. That is the Aban protests, as they were known in Iran or amongst Iranians, and indeed the Aban massacre last year, this time in Iran. And we want to, 1 year removed, get some perspective and context around what these widespread protests meant, what the significance of the brutal crackdown by the regime was, and where this all might be going. We have Nazanin, we have Roshanak Astaraki joining us from Cyprus, and Stuart Williams of Agence France-Presse from Paris joining us. That's coming up in just a few moments. Hi, Groovy Shaya.
Hello, Jian.
I hope you're okay. Salam. Salam Salam. Captain Reza, hello.
Hello, sir.
The fabulous Kayhan.
Hello, Jian.
Nice to see you in your kola cap. We're going to talk about the 1 year anniversary of the bloody protests last year in Iran, and there is so much conflict and difficulty in the world right now, you guys. Obviously ongoing for Iranians. We discussed this a lot. And then in the last few days, there was the murder of a prominent nuclear scientist in Iran a few days ago, which of course has raised concerns about an escalation of tensions with Iran and potentially the US and Israel and then within Iran. But I've concluded that we cannot only drown ourselves in sorrows, or we would never be able to pick ourselves up. So in the spirit of balance, let me, before we get into the 1 year anniversary of the Aban massacre and the protests and that discussion, let me also mention that it was International Ghormeh Sabzi Day this weekend. For some reason, Kayhan, by the way, on the basis of it being Ghormeh Sabzi Day weekend, there's like a bevy there's pots and pans full of Ghormeh Sabzi, because Ponce the Artist and Thoughtful Nagin both brought Ghormeh Sabzi in. I don't know why, but the last Saturday in November has been declared International Ghormeh Sabzi Day.
Is it like harvest season for Ghormeh Sabzi herbs?
That's right. That's
what's going on that they...
You go and pick Ghormeh Sabzi, and it comes into season at the end of November.
Shaya, do you know why? Why is it International Ghormeh Sabzi Day?
No, I could guess that because November is the end of autumn and it is the beginning of winter. So we want to cheer ourselves up to to let it go, the winter and the gloomy days.
It's like a comfort food, maybe to get your vitamins up before the winter season comes. That's my best guess.
I think we should just start declaring
Just accept
days for things. Wednesday will be Fesenjun Day. The third week of December is Ebi week.
Abgush Day. I'm looking forward to that.
Abgush month.
Abgush Day is a great idea. That should be a Friday night.
There's something something so powerful about the Abgush. It's like an essence.
Douk.
Oh, Douk week. Douk week.
Not a fan.
Really?
No.
Really?
Yeah,
Of
it's
any
so
kind
heavy.
of douk?
Well, douk, like, it's
Because
so
you
heavy.
can get the
It's
salted
like,
or non-salted. You get the fizzy.
but like, I don't know. It's too heavy to eat with Persian food. It's like too much. It's so thick and. Ugh.
Douk, for those of you who don't speak Persian, is a delicious yogurt liquid.
Carbonated, isn't it?
It's not always carbonated.
That's true.
There's douk, what, soft?
Douk bigaz, you mean?
Without gas.
Doesn't sound good.
Gasless douk.
No gas douk. Yeah. Anyway, I mean, I don't know how much. I was at a friend's house on Friday night, and I already had Ghormeh Sabzi. I don't know what is the statutory limit on how much Ghormeh Sabzi is too much Ghormeh Sabzi to eat.
Like weekly, I think is too much.
It's too much to eat it once a week, even.
I think that's too much.
How many times a month can I have Ghormeh Sabzi?
Once a month thing is just enough. You know how it smells.
Yes.
That stays with you forever.
Okay. So once a month, you limit yourself to Ghormeh Sabzi once a month. Captain Reza, how many times a month would you?
I'd say once a month. More so for the stench too. Like,
wow.
Yeah. I mean, we've covered that in the.
I think I first of all, when I make Ghormeh Sabzi, I make a lot of it, so I'm eating it for every few days. I have some more, and I'll freeze some, and I'll eat it. So this once a month rule would be I'd be crushed.
When I say once a month, I mean that's like that you get 1 week of Ghormeh Sabzi. That's what I mean.
See, that's all part of the same meal.
Just
just one
entire week of Ghormeh Sabzi a month is what you meant. All right. Well, we also have, before the show closes, it's a Monday. So Mona from Melbourne coming up with the proverb of the week. The Persian priestess of proverbs from Australia will be joining us in about, I don't know, I guess in 45 minutes, an hour after we speak about the Aban protests. She will either have a saying or an idiom or a word or a proverb. Now, I call her the priestess of proverbs, and last week it was an idiom.
In any case, I won't get any of them. I never do.
It doesn't. It's just academic to you. Whether it's a proverb or an idiom, you're not going to get it anyway. So Mona presents us with Persian proverbs that Keon and I have to guess. We usually don't come even close to it, and then Reza and Shaya get Cheshire cat grins on their faces.
I got the one time, the sheer to sheer. That was me, by the way.
Yeah.
You got sheer to sheer?
Yeah, I got that one. Not even
you got
Shaya.
khar to khar, but then that was a more polite version. But you get the credit.
Yeah. There we go.
Actually, I love the previous one, Shotor Didi Nadidi. I'm really excited for today.
The story of Shotor Didi Nadidi was great. You can hear that on our show from last week, number 64. So we'll get to Mona from Melbourne. Thank you, Captain Reza. Thank you, Groovy Shaya. Thank you, the fabulous Keon. Let's get to our feature theme for the day and our first guest. Nazanin Ansari is an Iranian-born journalist and the managing editor of Kayhan London and Kayhan Life. She was the London producer and chief correspondent for VOA Persian and moderated a bi-weekly roundtable discussion on Manoto television called In Hafte this week. She is a trustee of the Persia Educational Foundation and has served as the president and vice president of the Foreign Press Association in London. She also co-edited the Foreign Policy Centre's Iran Human Rights Review on the emergence of access to information as a pivotal element in promoting and protecting human rights. She is a regular panelist on BBC News' Dateline London program and provides news analysis about Iran on BBC Radio 4, CNN, International, Sky News, and Al Jazeera. As I mentioned, she's the editor at Kayhan London, but right now, Nazanin Ansari joins us from Paris, France today. Hello.
Hello, Jian, and thank you so much for your invitation.
Thank you so much for doing this, Nazanin. As I mentioned in the introduction of this program, I want to do this in 3 stages. We'll be joined by Roshanak Astaraki in a little while to talk about the impact of the killings on the families of the victims in Iran, some of the details of what happened and the campaigns for change and justice that have emerged. And Stuart Williams will be joining us later with his take on what he thinks the next steps are and what the legacy of Aban 2019 will be. But we wanted to first set the stage for what we're talking about and come to you for general context. Nazanin, remind anyone who was not following the story, and from your perspective, what happened last year in the month of Aban in Iran, essentially around this time 1 year ago?
Yes, I mean, the importance of Aban 2019 is November 2019, is that the demonstrations and the protests spread to 100 cities in about 48 hours. And what we saw was that the regime finally reacted in a very vicious way, killing over 1,500 protesters. And what we know now are the names. The names are coming out, and they're very young. Their videos, their photos. But one thing to keep in mind is that these protests had been brewing for a very long time in Iran. In the early 1990s, we witnessed urban riots. Between 1999 and 2003, we had student protests. Then we had the Green Movement, the Green Revolution, that many of your listeners might remember,
yes.
That were in response to the 2009 elections. And then since 2016 onwards, and this is after the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal as we came to know it, the economic pressures started building up. And then we had the sanctions from 2010 onwards, and we had the rising inequality between those, the haves and the have-nots. So we had more protests, frequent protests by teachers, nurses, bus drivers, industrial and agricultural workers, pensioners, who many of them cited broken promises and the unjust working conditions as a cause for their protests. For example, in 2015, we had 400 labor protests in Iran. And then in 2017, they spiked to over 900. So it started in December 2017, the first mass protests against the regimes. And then, unlike the Green Movement, the 2017 protests were called for political liberalization. And then suddenly we had, between 2017 and 2019, we had a whole series of protests by girls, My Stealthy Freedom, that protested against Iran's compulsory public hijab law for
yes.
women and girls.
Yes.
And then we also had the arrest of environmentalists. So it was like it was brewing underneath. And then in November 2019, the protests were spread in over 100 towns and cities and left over 1,500 civilians dead.
Okay, so this is great. I mean, you've given a great little history of the run-up to this and why this
yes.
wasn't an anomalous situation. But the
yes.
orthodox narrative around these protests, I mean, if you sort of news reports, et cetera, and the subsequent suppression of them by the regime, the analysis was that this was a reaction to gas price hikes. Is that reductive? I mean, is it as simple as that? Or given this broader historical context you've given us, was this something that was brewing and the gas price hikes were the last straw?
Yes, the gas price hikes were last straw, and they basically provided the context for the protest. It was economic at the beginning, but then it became radicalized and became more political. So we could see it in the slogans of the protesters, that they had gone as far as calling for a revolution, chanting "No reform, no referendum, just strikes and revolution," or "This is your last month, it is time to go." This was directed to Mr. Khamenei. And the slogan started targeting Mr. Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic. And so they were calling for his death. They were saying, for example, the supreme leader lives like a god. We, the people, live like beggars. So whereas in 2009 and others, there were more economic protests, then we saw from 2017 onwards, they're directed at the supreme leader, they're directed at the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic, saying, for example, the protest was no Gaza, my life only for Iran. So we have seen, and this has been going, and also the age of the protesters is very important. They became much younger, and they became more secular demands, that they no longer wanted to be led by clerics. So you can see the progression of the feelings of the Iranian protesters in their slogans.
Let me ask you a few quick questions because you said a lot there.
Yes.
First of all, I mean, the protests were, entirely understandable, but they seemed, from an outsider's perspective, to lack any central leadership or specific collective objectives. If that's the case, how did they spread so quickly over 100 cities? In other words, is this just via social media? How did it grow so quickly and so widespread?
Well, certainly we didn't see a kind of a central command, but what we did see and witness was the same kind of slogans going around. For example, like "Not Gaza, not Lebanon, I give my life for Iran" was one of the main slogans, or the chants "Death to the dictator" or "Death to the Islamic Republic." So what we saw is that the protesters knew what they did no longer wanted. In 2009, I go back to 2009, we heard a lot of Allahu Akbars. But certainly from 2017 onwards, they were no longer calling for either Allahu Akbar or religious slogans. They had become secular.
Yes.
And so in a sense, you could see their unity in what they did not want. And what we are seeing now, since 2019 onwards, is a sense of what they really do want. And what they do want is basically the life of what Iranians outside of Iran, the same kind of opportunities they have outside of Iran, they are wanting that. They look around themselves, they look at the history of Iran. There's a lot of going back to history and seeing where Iran was before, whether it was economic conditions or even going as far back as 2,500 years ago with Cyrus the Great, who basically is famous for freeing the slaves of Babylonia, especially the Jews, for human rights. So these are what they do not want, and what they hope for, their aspirations, are what unites them.
What does it tell you that the age of the protesters by 2019 is significantly younger than it was, say, in the Green Movement or in other movements? What do we conclude from that?
A sense of hopelessness, that when they look to the future, they don't see they have anything to lose by going out on the streets. Now, whether it is what we saw in 2019 was the spread and the depth of this frustration, and also a sense of unity. What they are hoping for is for an alternative to be able to unite them, to provide an alternative on how to reach that future. Now, where is that alternative? It is certainly, from what we hear from the different political groupings and social groupings and the civil society, that the alternative is within themselves. That is, that it is us that can bring about change and no one else. That the change has to come from within Iran, and they're the ones that need to be the agents for that change.
Although there's still no unified opposition group, which is a part of the issue. Although let me get to that. First of all, the reason we're talking about this, as you know, is that this isn't just another protest in another part of the world or even in Iran. This was marked by a significant and devastating amount of bloodshed. It's said to be the deadliest political unrest in Iran since the revolution 40 years earlier. And we have heard varying accounts of the lives lost. I mean, some reports said 180 and then 400, and then you mentioned 1,500. Some have said more than that. Have we learned anything more 1 year removed about just how many citizens were killed in these uprisings?
Unfortunately, when you deal with Iran at the moment and the Islamic Republic, the statistics and the numbers you get is not very accurate, whether it is about the number of the dead, whether it is about corona, whether it is the economic statistics. The numbers are not there. So that's why you mentioned that there's all this discrepancy between various numbers. The 1,500 number was the one that was mentioned by Reuters, and certainly what we do see are the photos and the videos of these protesters like Navid Afkari or others who are going into the protests and videoing themselves, and these are the ones who were also later killed. And unfortunately, that's why access to information is so critical to know exactly what is going on. We have anecdotal evidence. We do hear reports here and there. But because there is not, Amnesty International has not been allowed to visit Iran for a long time, or the UN special rapporteurs on Iran. That has been one of their main grievances, that they do not have access to the country itself. So what we get and what is just videos from people coming, from inside Iran.
Well, you've written about that. How do we get access?
The access is through internet. That's why one of the most important elements of the November 2019 protest was that for over 10 days, they shut down the internet.
Yes.
There was a report by Radio Farda journalists saying that in the days prior to the protest, the amount of engagement that they had was over 50 million with, as far as Twitter, social media, all that, but with Radio Farda journalists. And that's a Liberty Radio that is based in Prague. And but then once the internet was shut down, all this engagement came down to less than 4 million. So access to information is the most important way for not only citizens to know information about their living standards, about their life, but how they can bring about change. And that's why for the Islamic Republic, its best weapon has always been to shut down the internet, so that it can cut down the access between inside Iran and the outside world.
Which is, of course, against international law, but we saw them do it last year, and a lot of us were protesting it. But it was effective in a way, because it retarded the ability for information to come out and for people to know just exactly what was happening. And what was happening, Nazanin, as you know, is that this regime, even though it's known for its brutality, there were people just being shot in the streets, and this was still shocking, even though we've heard these horrendous stories for decades now coming out of the Islamic Republic, and the detentions and the suppression of dissent and all of that. To have mass shootings in the street, this use of lethal force against people throughout the country was unprecedented even by the Islamic Republic's standards of violence. Why did the regime see these protests as so threatening that they would go to this extent to suppress them?
Because, first of all, they were by people, the Islamic Republic came to power because it wanted to bring, it promised the people on the street, those, the underdogs, the underprivileged, heaven. And after 40 years, what they had promised, had not been delivered. And these were like what people talk about, some experts talk about the revolution of the sans-culottes, just like the French Revolution. They have nothing. Roshanak can explain to you better later on the amount of poverty that is in Iran, not for those in the cities, not in Tehran, but the disparity of wealth between the urban dwellers and those on the sides of the urban cities. That is really heart-wrenching when you feel and you hear that people, whether it's on Instagram or Twitter, talking about, okay, where am I going to get my next food, or at the price of eggs going, or the price of bread increasingly day by day. At one point, inflation was increasing by double digit every month. And when you see factories closing down and factory workers not being able to take food for their families. I mean, we saw a lot of labor movement.
But when the security forces are killing people, you've got to assume they feel threatened. Otherwise, they wouldn't do that, would they? I mean, we sort of get tired of saying this from outside of Iran looking in, but that this is the time, this is when the change is going to come. But do you think that even the regime itself thought that, oh boy, this could be the end of our days if these protests get too widespread and too big?
Yes, that's why they, as you said, they used violence. They felt that there was even an incident that there was in one of the cities that the security forces had to retreat. They could not stand the number of protesters and that were actually becoming more violent. So they had no choice but to use live ammunition. And mind you, it didn't end with the killings of the 1,500 protesters, that the numbers that we know. It has continued, and we still hear families, for example, the family of Navid Afkari. Navid Afkari was a champion wrestler, who they arrested, but they arrested his two brothers as well. They're still in prison. And they went in 2009, they arrested 1,500 people, and it died down. The protest died down. There was nothing else. And even the protesters, they would go out on the streets in the day, and at night they would go home. But in 2019, they stayed outside. They stayed out and they continued during the night. And so, yes, that's why they used live ammunition, and that's why the arrests still continue.
It's an election year in Iran, for what it's worth. There's some analysts who say that these protests and the nature of them, both in terms of the severity or the numbers of people out in the streets, and then the nature of the way that they were suppressed, delivered a severe blow to President Hassan Rouhani, a relative moderate in Iran's political spectrum, and provided a guarantee that the hardliners would win the upcoming parliamentary elections and the presidency within a year now. Do you think that's true? I mean, do you think that these protests and the suppression of them have a political impact within who is going to be governing Iran?
Let's be clear about one thing. The point is, Mr. Rouhani, whoever runs in the elections in Iran at this stage, they have to be part of the system. It is not a system of free elections. It's more like a selection. Mr. Rouhani has been part of the Islamic Republic security apparatus since the start. Mr. Khatami as well. They're part of the system. So what we see right now is that the state itself has lost its legitimacy. Now, I mentioned my stealthy freedom, the movement by the girls against hijab laws.
Yes.
If you look at the Constitution of the Islamic Republic, the Constitution of the Islamic Republic is a theocratic constitution where women, their life and the rights they have as a citizen is worth half of that of a man. And throughout these, for the longest time, even within the reform movement within the Islamic Republic, they've tried to bring about change. And that is another thing. People are tired and they have given up on reform, that this system is no longer reformable. It cannot reform itself. Yes, it's like you have a nice car that the engine is not working. You keep changing the paint of the car or the wheels, but the engine is no longer working. And what we see in the Islamic Republic today is a lot of self-made crisis, that because there is not proper governance, where there's a lack of accountability, where 80% of the economy is owned by foundations that do not pay any taxes, that is what the protesters and that is what the everyday man on the street is paying attention to. So the next elections is very important to see who will be coming in. So there's a lot of talk that the Revolutionary Guards, it is going to be militarized. But let's not forget, Iran has been in the control of the Revolutionary Guards and people in the foundation, the religious foundation, since the start. So now it's becoming more transparent, and the people are saying we do not want it. Where do they go from here? That remains to be seen.
Well, that's actually a good segue to my final question for you, because you've touched on a lot there, and we're going to actually get into a little bit of the U.S.'s position and U.S. sanctions and whether a change in government in America will make a difference with Stuart Williams coming up. But let me ask you before I let you go. I mean, with everything you've just said, the economy has only gotten worse since last year in Iran. I mean, tremendously so. If there were a precipitant for the uprising last year being the economy, it's only increased in recent months. Growing economic disparity, a deadly pandemic, seeming chaos at times. Where do you believe this is, in the context of what happened a year ago in the streets of Iran, and fast forwarding to a year later where things are even worse on the ground for Iranians? Where do you believe this is all going, Nazanin?
The prognosis for the Islamic Republic doesn't look good, in the sense that, yes, they do need cash. They do need cash to be able to give out short-term relief to those who are most in need. But at the end of the day, the macro doesn't look good and the micro doesn't look good, in the sense that if Iran wants to be able to join and do business either with Europe or with China, with Russia, it needs to be able to have a proper, accountable, transparent financial system. To do that, we've got the Palermo Convention of the UN, and which is the anti-money laundering, anti-terrorism financial system that it has to join, which is called FATF. The Financial Action Task Force has been wanting Iran to sign off and join it for over many years. It has extended the deadline 7 times for Iran. At each juncture, at each turn, even though the government has wanted to join it, when it comes to the forces, the real forces, the men in the dark shadows that are governing Iran, they do not want it. They do not have put a stop to it. So even if, for example, Iran at this moment wants to join China, get its loans from China, or do business with Chinese banks instead of American banks, it cannot, because it is not part of the Financial Action Task Force. So unless it joins certain international covenants and abide by them, it will not be able to do any business. Will a new IRGC president, a military president, be able to do that? I highly doubt it, because the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, have been impeding the joining of FATF for the longest time.
Nazanin Ansari, I thank you so much for this today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much, Jian, for having me, and thank you very much for your very in-depth questions.
Hope to talk to you again soon. Merci. Enjoy yourself in France if you can do so during a pandemic.
Exactly. I hope so.
Bye-bye.
Maybe next year.
Yes, exactly. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Nazanin Ansari is an Iranian-born journalist and the managing editor of Kayhan London and Kayhan Life. She joined us from Paris, France today. Okay, this is a Roqe look at Bloody November, 1 year later in Iran. And for a more specific look at who was killed, how the families and friends have reacted, and the dark legacy of Aban, let's turn to Roshanak Astaraki. Roshanak is a freelance journalist focusing on Iran, and we have agreed that I will ask questions in English, she will answer in Farsi. So, if you do not speak Persian and you are listening on Spotify, iTunes, or SoundCloud, you may want to switch to YouTube, Telegram, or Instagram, where this conversation will be subtitled. Roshanak has contributed to several outlets, including Hambastagi newspaper, Radio Kuche, Rah Digar, Jaras, Asr Sevom, and Paya Economics magazine, as well as Monorail magazine. She has worked with Kayhan London since 2014, where she focuses on Iran's economy and current affairs. She left Iran in 2008 due to the pressures of Iranian intelligence and security forces. She has reported extensively on the Aban protests and their impact on the victims and families of those killed. Roshanak Astaraki joins me from Cyprus right now. Hello.
سلام، خسته نباشیم و خوشحالم در خدمت شما و شنوندگانتون هستم.
Merci, Roshanak John. Thank you so much for coming on. I want to start with something a little more specific when it comes to Aban and what happened last year. The worst violence documented during the uprising was apparently in the city of Mahshar and its suburbs. Witnesses and medical personnel said the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, members surrounded, shot, and killed up to 100 demonstrators, mostly unarmed young men, in a marsh where they had sought refuge. What happened in Mahshar?
اتفاقی که در ماهشهر افتاده بود، من با چند نفر از شهروندان ماهشهری که همون پارسال صحبت کردم، این بود که اعتراضات مثل اعتراضاتی که در تمام شهرهای ایران شکل گرفته بود در ماهشهر هم شکل گرفته بود. مردم به خیابان آمده بودن، اعتراض میکردن. اعتراضات چند ساعت با داشتن خیابون‌ها در دست مردم، خیابون‌های اصلی ماهشهر، ادامه پیدا کرده بود. نیروهای پلیس و نیروهای امنیتی حضور داشتن، از مردم عکاسی و فیلمبرداری می‌کردن، اما به مردم شلیک نکرده بودن، تا اینکه وانت‌هایی رو مردم می‌بینن که با چند نفر با اسلحه توی وانت هستن و میان به سمت جمعیت. اونجا پلیس شلیک میکنه و مردم این وسط گیر میکنن و به سرعت سعی میکنن در کوچه‌های اطراف پراکنده بشن. این درگیری کشیده میشه به حاشیه شهر ماهشهر، اونجایی که ما ازش به عنوان نیزار شنیدیم، و اون درگیری کشیده میشه به اون منطقه. نیروهای مسلح که جمهوری اسلامی مدعی هست این نیروهای تجزیه طلب عرب بودن، با اسلحه درگیر میشن و این درگیری نظامی شکل میگیره و متاسفانه توی این درگیری بین نیروهایی که تجزیه طلب هستن در اون منطقه و نیروهای سپاه پاسداران، متاسفانه تعداد زیادی از اهالی بومی اون منطقه قربانی میشن، از جمله تعدادی نوجوان که به هر حال توی اون شرایط که اینها معترض بودن و بعد این اتفاق افتاده، خیلی ها از نوجوانا رو و جوونا رو نتونستن خانواده تو خونه نگه دارن، اونا رفته بودن، بعضی از سر هیجان و کنجکاوی، بعضی واقعا برای اعتراض، و متاسفانه اونها هم در این میان هم قربانی دادن، کشته دادن و هم مجروح دادن.
You talked about the profile there just a moment ago. You touched on the profile of some of these protesters in Mashhad. In general, in all the cities that this was happening in Aban last year, what can you tell us about who the protests were? Nazanin was just talking about their relative youth. They were particularly young compared to previous protests that we've seen in the last 40 years. What can you tell us about the people who were on the streets and the people, in many cases, who ended up getting shot?
ببینید مردمی که در آبان 98 به خیابون اومدن مردم عادی بودن که در ایران زندگی روزمره دارن، مردمی هستن که در بینشون اقشار فرودست هست، کارگر بود، افراد حاشیه نشین بود، بینشون افراد تحصیل کرده بود، بینشون وکیل ما شناسایی کردیم، پزشک شناسایی کردیم، استاد دانشگاه شناسایی کردیم، معلم و بازنشسته بود. و ببینید مردم ایران 40 سال خسته هستن و 40 سال زیر فشارن. فشارهای اجتماعی و سیاسی یک سطحی از نارضایتی رو ایجاد میکنه، اما فشار اقتصادی برای فردی که به طور مثال بچه، این مثال هایی که میزنم افرادی هستند که خودم باشون صحبت کردم، به طور مثال کارگری که 2 بچه کوچیک، بچه شیرخواره در خونه داره، بچه دبستانی در خونه داره و از کار بیکار میشه به دلیل که کارخونه‌ای که داره توش کار میکنه توانایی ادامه شرایط کار رو نداره، باید هزینه‌هاش رو بیاره پایین و اخراج کارگر اولین راهیه که کارفرماها سراغش میرن در این شرایط. در ایران اخراج شده و 2 ماه داره دنبال کار میگرده، بچه گرسنه است، پول شیر خشک بچهش رو نداره بده و بعد میبینه در خیابون اعتراضی شکل میگیره، میره در اون اعتراض و به گفته خودش با تمام وجود شعار میده. مردمی که زیر فشارهای مختلف اقتصادی، سیاسی، اجتماعی و حتی فرهنگی، زیر سانسور فرهنگی هستن، قطعاً از هر فرصتی به نظر من استفاده خواهند کرد و به خیابون خواهند ریخت، چون تنها راه چاره رو این میبینن.
And when you talk about that it being so widespread, this cross-section of people, ordinary people, workers, young, old, people who are suffering from their kids are hungry, economic disparity, the protests, you get this sense of them being very visceral and understandably so. As you say, people with they're out in the streets. Did the protests suffer from not having some kind of central organization? There's been a lot of analysis to say these were disparate groups, even though everybody was united in opposing the regime. There's no common sort of objective opposition goals. Is that a problem in a protest situation like last year in Aban?
ببینید خب مسلما من معتقدم این ضعف اپوزیسیون جمهوری اسلامی در خارج از ایران داره که به صورت هماهنگ شده و سازماندهی شده عمل نمیکنه. به دلیل همین هم هست که اپوزیسیون با اینکه از لحاظ کمیت و تعداد زیاده، حالا گروه‌های مختلف سیاسی، ولی در طی 40 سال نتونسته از لحاظ کیفی و کیفیتی خوب عمل کنه. این نظر شخصی منه. منتها یک عامل دیگه هم به نظر من شیوه سرکوب جمهوری اسلامیه. یعنی جمهوری اسلامی در آبان 98 نشون داد که برای موندن بر سر قدرت اصلا هیچ ملاحظه‌ای نداره، یعنی هیچ چیزی بازدارنده نیست برای نظام جمهوری اسلامی که بخواد در مقابل اعتراضات خیابانی مردم سکوت کنه یا در واقع مماشات بکنه. هرچند که ما میبینیم در حوزه فعالیت‌های مجازی هم به همین شکله، یعنی جمهوری اسلامی الان زنداناش پر از بچه‌های جوانی هست که مثلا کانال تلگرامی داشته، فعالیت فیزیکی علیه جمهوری اسلامی نکرده. در نتیجه اون قوه سرکوب جمهوری اسلامی رو هم نمیشه نادیده گرفت.
Let me ask you, Roshanak, about those who carry out these crimes. You know, we often talk about the regime or the IRGC as this monolithic, series of bad guys. And but I sometimes wonder, who are they? I mean, who were the henchmen in this case who committed the atrocities on behalf of the regime? Which segment of the Iranian society do they come from? How are they recruited? And how can they shoot their own people without hesitation?
ببینید در مورد آمر این داستان، کسی که دستور رو صادر میکنه، اونچه که به صورت رسمی اعلام شده، وزارت کشور دولت آقای روحانی این کار رو کرده، هم دستور برخورد شدید رو صادر کرده به دلیل اینکه امنیت درونی ایران زیر مجموعه وزارت کشور، یعنی وزارت کشور از لحاظ قانونی هم این چیز رو داره، مسئولیت رو داره، ولی به هر حال وزارت کشور، شخص وزیر کشور دستور رو داده، منتها توی قطعی اینترنت هم به همین شکل. ولی گزارشی رویترز منتشر کرده مبنی بر اینکه و این به نقل از منابع آگاه درون ایران بوده که اساساً یک جلسه اتفاق میفته بعد از روز 25 آبان که اعتراضات شکل میگیره و خب روز خیلی در واقع پر اعتراضی بود در همه شهرها، 100 خورده شهر اعتراض داشتیم و در اون جلسه که اعضای مقامات ارشد نظام جمهوری اسلامی بودن و خامنه‌ای در اون جلسه بوده، خامنه‌ای ازشون میخواد که اعتراضات رو سریع جمع بکنید و نباید ادامه پیدا کنه و حتی تهدید کرده که اگر این اعتراضات ادامه پیدا بکنه، تمام مقاماتی که میتونستن کاری کنن اعتراضات ادامه پیدا نکنه و کمکاری کردن بعدم باید پاسخگو باشن. که خب از همون چند ساعت بعد، یعنی در همون روز 25 غروب، اینترنت به طور سراسری قطع میشه در ایران و بیشترین کشتار از همون غروب روز 25 شروع میشه که بی ملاحظه شروع میکنن به شلیک مستقیم به مردم. در مورد اینکه چه نهادی اون در واقع شلیک‌ها رو انجام میدهن، بعد این توضیح رو بدم که نیروهای امنیتی و نظامی موازی که در ایران وجود داره همه در این داستان نقش دارن. یعنی ما وزارت اطلاعات رو داریم، نیروهای خودش رو داره که خیلی‌هاشون هم مسلح هستن، اسلحه‌های کمری دارن، سازمان اطلاعات سپاه رو داریم، بسیج رو داریم، پلیس فتح رو داریم که در حوزه اینترنتی فعال هست ولی خب اقدامات امنیتی هم انجام میده. در حوزه نظامی ما نیروی انتظامی رو داریم، پلیس راهنمایی رانندگی رو داریم که مطلقاً تا الان گزارشی نداشتیم مبنی بر اینکه دخالت کرده باشه در این اعتراضات برای کشتار مردم، ولی نیروی انتظامی رو داریم، یگانهای ضد شورش رو داریم، خود نیروهای سپاه رو داریم و گزارش نشون میده همه اینا نقش داشتن. یعنی همه اینها در شهرهای مختلف که گزارشاش اومده، همه اینا نقش داشتن توی شلیک به مردم. حتی نیروهای بسیجی که در واقع توی پایگاه بسیج مثلا مساجد و اینها هستن، اونها هم حتی گزارش بوده که به مردم شلیک کردن.
You've been in touch, I understand, with the families of victims of this tragedy last year in Aban. From what I understand, the families are undaunted in their search for justice around what happened. Tell me what you've heard from some of these families, Roshanak.
ببینید، من دلم میخواد اول این رو توضیح بدم که خانواده جانباخته ها در ایران، خانواده هایی که فرزندشون یا والدشون در این اعتراضات یا خواهر یا برادرشون کشته شده، جمهوری اسلامی به نظر من به سرعت میتونه این خانواده ها و ظرفیت ها و نقاط ضعفشون رو در عرض شاید چند ساعت شناسایی کنه و بفهمه که با هر خانواده‌ای چه داستانی رو پیش ببره. ببینید، مثلا من مثال بزنم، ما خانواده پویا بختیاری رو داریم در اعتراضات آبان 98 که مادر معلم دبستان، فعالیت صنفی در حوزه آموزگاران و معلمان برای حقوق معلمان داشته. خود خانواده کلاً یک نگاه ملی‌گرایانه داشتن همیشه که خب جمهوری اسلامی به شدت زاویه داره با نگاه‌های ملی‌گرایانه و حالا بچه اینها به سر شلیک میشه و از بین میره. جمهوری اسلامی میدونه این خانواده رو باید مهار کرد و از همون لحظه اول در بیمارستان شروع میکنه اینها رو تهدید کردن. یعنی اینها دارن خانواده میشنون که پویا زخمی شده اومده بیمارستان، هنوز نمیدونن که پویا فوت کرده و خانواده که میرسن همزمان نیروی امنیتی در بیمارستان منتظر اینهاست اصلا و شروع به تهدید میکنن، برای خاک سپاریش تهدید میکنن و از همون روزهای اول پدر مادر زیر فشار احضار و بازجویی قرار میگیرن که باید سکوت کنید که خب سکوت نکردن. منتها همه خانواده ها اینطوری نیستن. بعضی از خانواده ها هستن که در برابر تهدیدها و در برابر فشارها منزوی میشن. بعضی خانواده ها هستن میترسن که واقعا این که نیروی امنیتی تهدید میکنه که پسرت رو گرفتم دخترت هم ازت میگیرم، واقعا دخترش رو ببرم و بکشن یا زندان کنن و سکوت میکنه. بعضی خانواده هم هستن که همراهی حتی ممکنه بکنن، مثل کاری که پدر نیکیتا کرد و اومد مصاحبه کرد با جمهوری اسلامی. منتها عمده خانواده ها یک خشم بزرگی در درونشون میمونه و این خشم باز بروز پیدا میکنه. یعنی جمهوری اسلامی یه جور چرخه تولید خشم و اعتراض رو خودش داره مدام به حرکت در میاره بین مردم ایران با همین رفتارها.
You mentioned the father of Nikita. What can you tell us about her?
نیکیتا دختر 14-15 ساله‌ای بود که در تهران به سر شلیک شد و در همون خیابان جانش را از دست داد. بر اساس اطلاعاتی که به من رسیده پدر و مادر نیکیتا سالها بوده از هم جدا شده بودن و نیکیتا به همراه خواهرش با مادرش زندگی می‌کردن، اصلا با پدر زندگی نمی‌کردن. منتها پدرشون رو می‌دیدن، ارتباط داشتن و زمانی که نیکیتا فوت میکنه اصلا پیش مادرش بوده، از خونه مادر، یعنی خونه که زندگی می‌کرده خونه مادر میاد بیرون و در خیابون بوده و چون گفته بوده ممکنه برم به پدرم سر بزنم، مادر وقتی نیکیتا بر نمیگرده بعد از چند ساعت نگران نمیشه، ولی بعدش پیگیر میشه و به همین دلیل اینها دیر متوجه میشن که نیکیتا در خیابان کشته شده و بعد که متوجه میشن هم که خب سریع با فشار نیروهای امنیتی نیکیتا رو به خاک میسپارن. مادر زیر تهدید قرار میگیره، به همین دلیل سکوت کرده تا الان. ما هیچ خبری یا گزارشی یا در واقع آمادگی برای مصاحبه از سمت مادر و خانواده مادری نیکیتا نداشتیم تا الان، ولی خب پدرش به دلیل دیدگاه‌های مذهبی که داشته و به دلیل اینکه به هر حال زیر فشار، یعنی من اینکه یک پدری که به هر دلیلی بچهش رو از دست داده شما بتونی قانعش کنی که بیا بشین علیه بچه خودت، علیه اقدامی که بچت کرده یا به نفع اون کسی که جان بچه‌ش رو گرفته صحبت کن، به هر حال این زیر یک فشاره. حتی اگر اون آدم متوجه نشه که داره باهاش بازی امنیتی میشه یا داره بهش فشار و تهدید امنیتی وارد میشه، ولی به هر حال پدرش با مصاحبه کرد با صدا و سیمای جمهوری اسلامی و گفت دخترش معترض نبوده و گفت خبری که در رسانه ها هست دروغه، در حالی که نیکیتا در خیابان روز 25 کشته شد و این خبر رو ما موثق داریم. حتی یکی از دراویش گنابادی که پیشتر بازداشت شده بود در اون خیابون حضور داشت. بعد از اینکه عکس‌های نیکیتا رو من منتشر کردم و اعلام کردم که این هم یکی از جانباختگان هست و یکی از کودکان جانباخته است چون زیر 18 سال سن داشت، ایشون به من پیام داد و گفت این دختر رو من نمیدونستم اسمش چیه ولی این پیش چشم من جونش رو از دست داد و من دقیقاً کنارش نشسته بودم به اتفاق بقیه مردمی که تو خیابون بودیم. به هر حال برخورد خانواده ها میتونه متفاوت باشه، اما من معتقدم خشمی که در وجود این خانواده ها شکل میگیره خشمیه که به این سرعت از بین نخواهد رفت و حتما جمهوری اسلامی به نظر من بهای این خشمی که ایجاد کرده رو خواهد پرداخت.
These are such devastating stories. A 14-year-old girl. Let me ask you a final question. I thank you so much for the time you're giving us today, Roshanak. the campaigns that have been started by families of the victims, those who are speaking out, those who do have the courage and are like Pouya Bakhlari's mother you mentioned, I wonder if they're not going to stop their campaigns. And as we have an accumulation of these types of campaigns around the world, there's a lot of families, for example, of the victims of Flight 752 here in Canada and around the world who are leading campaigns against the Iranian regime for justice for their family members who died. These campaigns will somehow become a form of united opposition against this regime. Does that somehow make sense to you?
این کمپینا به نظر من در مقابله با جمهوری اسلامی اثرگذار هستند، اما یک موضوع مهم اینه که به نظر من چیزی که من در این سالها دیدم در مورد معترضان و در مورد سرنوشت هایی که پیدا میکنن، بحث این هستش که واقعا چقدر موضوع حقوق بشر برای دنیا مهمه، چقدر موضوع حقوق بشر در ایران برای دنیا مهمه. ببینید مردم ایران با دست خالی در برابر نظامی ایستادن که سالهای سال تمام ثروت یک کشور غنی رو در دست گرفته و قدرت مالی، قدرت نظامی و قدرت امنیتی بسیار بالایی داره. همین امروز ما خبر داشتیم که دولت آقای روحانی اجازه داده که نیروهای وزارت اطلاعات 50% افزایش پیدا کنند و گزارش هایی که پیشتر اومده بود، هرچند که آمار رسمی نداریم، 30,000 نیروی وزارت اطلاعات وجود داشته در ایران و شما حساب کنید 15,000 نیروی امنیتی داره اضافه میشه به این سازمان که یکی از سازمان های امنیتیه. مردم ایران در برابر این رژیم ایستادن و اینترنت روشون قطع میشه، به گلوله و رگبار کشیده میشن ولی باز ایستادن. بحث اینه که آیا واقعا حقوق بشر در ایران، آیا واقعا اون بچه هایی که در ایران کشته میشن، اون هزاران نفری که زندانی هن، اون بچه هایی که 7-8 نفری که الان به دلیل حضور در اعتراضات به اعدام محکوم شدن و هر لحظه ممکنه بالای دار برن، چقدر برای دنیا مهمه و چقدر دنیا، چه دولت ها چه سازمان های حقوق بشری حاضرن کنار مردم ایران بایستن و از اونها حمایت بکنن تا بتونن این اعتراضات رو به نتیجه برسونن.
Roshanak Astaraki, I thank you so خیلی متشکرم. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your eloquence and your information. Appreciate it.
خواهش میکنم. ممنون از شما.
خداحافظ.
خداحافظ.
That's Roshanak Astaraki, a freelance journalist working with Kayhan London, where she focuses on Iran's economy and current affairs. Roshanak Astaraki joined us from Cyprus today. This is Roqe on SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, Instagram, YouTube, and Telegram. Well, to discuss what the legacy of Bloody November 2019 in Iran is 1 year later, we turn to Stuart Williams. Stuart is a Paris-based international correspondent for Agence France-Presse. He was born in Wimbledon, UK, and holds a degree in modern and medieval languages from Oxford. He has just finished a stint as AFP's deputy bureau chief in Turkey. His previous posts have included Tehran, Moscow, Paris, and Frankfurt. He has written and reported extensively about Iran and the Aban protests. And Stuart Williams joins me from Paris right now. Hello, sir.
Hi, nice to hear you. How are you?
Very nice to have you on the program, Stuart. What do you believe the legacy of the Aban protests and bloodshed is 1 year later?
I mean, it's obvious it's still early to assess maybe the legacy, and as we're not standing in Iran itself, one must always, it's hard to make the judgment with the distance. But I think if one looks at the modern history of Iran after the Islamic Revolution, you have what happened in 2009 after the disputed election, and now you have the Aban protest. These are moments which leave a historical mark on contemporary Iran. They're moments which the authorities don't move on from with everything forgotten and left behind. It leaves a scar on society, and it creates a shadow over everything that comes next. And now, obviously, Iran at the moment is in a very difficult situation because of the economic situation, because of the maximum pressure. Different people analyze the effects of that in different ways, but the Aban protest obviously showed the capacity for anger in Iran, and also the capacity of the Iranian system, the Iranian regime, to hit back at that in a very severe manner. So it's certainly a landmark, a moment in modern Iranian history, and how important it is, I think, only time will tell in the future.
Let me pick up on the last thing you said there about the regime hitting back in the way it did. The Aban massacre is probably now the most deadly incident in Iran's contemporary history. Why did the regime resort to such extreme violence?
Well, I think the situation is extremely delicate in Iran at the moment, and remember the context. The Aban protests were followed also by the shooting down of the Iranian airliner, which also prompted protests, and there was a crackdown also on those protests. So it's quite a febrile situation at the moment because of the maximum pressure, because of the economic problems, but also because obviously Iran, as we know, is a very technologically literate country. People are wired up to the internet and to social media. They're on social media channels despite the restrictions. They know how to subvert them as well. And so it's very well connected to things. People are aware of what's going on. And so there is a capacity for protest in Iran. It's a very young country. The youth population is extremely strong. People have ambitions in Iran. They want a better future. And so the potential is there. And because the economic situation is getting harder and harder, the potential for protest is so much there. And that means the Islamic regime is watching very closely what happens on the streets, and obviously perceives these street actions as a threat to its authority. And that is why, I think, is the evident answer why the response is quite so ruthless as it is, and that response still continues. And what we hear in terms of not looking into any judicial accountability for what happened, and also in terms of even pressuring, from what we hear from activists on the ground in Iran and outside, pressuring families who lost loved ones in the protests not to speak out and not to seek retribution for what happened.
Stuart, based on your reporting and what you learned while covering this over the last year, how effective was that internet shutdown? And not only in retarding or preventing the information coming out of Iran for people like us to know what's going on, but for the coordination of the protests amongst those who were in the streets inside Iran?
I mean, it's hard to say from here. On the second point, I think the protests happened on quite a large scale and were halted not so much by the internet shutdown, but by the forceful response from the authorities. I think at the time, having watched this from outside at the time, I think few people were aware of the scale of what was happening. Obviously, people were aware there were protests in Iran. This is unusual. It was a news story in the US, in Canada, in Europe, etc. But it wasn't something that was really maybe that as intense as it would have been if people had known at the time the extent of what was going on, how large the protests were, and then how severe the crackdown was. Because of the internet shutdown, because of the fact that videos were not filtering out of of the country in the way that they would have done normally in the year 2019, with all the the technological connection we have, that really prevented it becoming potentially a major international issue at the time, and maybe softened the pressure that there would have been on the regime in terms of international response, international criticism from governments, from NGOs, etc. at the time, because the evidence, which people need evidence to make points, was relatively scarce, and many people had to make assumptions. And only now, many months later, is the material emerging in some quantity, and the activists and the experts can now sift through it and make their conclusions based on evidence and numbers, and not make assumptions about what happened.
What does America what role does America play in all this? It's no secret that under the Trump administration, the U.S. scuttled the nuclear deal with Iran, the JCPOA, and then subsequently imposed heavier sanctions. What is your take on the role of the U.S. and the U.S. sanctions in fostering what happened last year?
Well, I think the Trump administration tried to use sanctions as a very, very blunt and quite ruthless instrument. Obviously, no one doubts that the maximum pressure and the sanctions have had an effect on the ground in Iran. You just need to look at the hardships of ordinary people. It's another matter, and I think experts are quite divided on this, whether that will translate neatly, as obviously the Trump administration hoped, into people being angry against the regime. Iran, as we know, has a long history of outside interference in its own affairs, going back to Mossadegh, etc., and before. And it's generally, and I felt this when I lived there, that whatever the political persuasion of Iranians inside Iran, they don't take very kindly to being dictated what to do from outside. And so it's not a clean assumption to make that just because America causes this economic hardship inside Iran, the Iranians themselves will take that hardship out on the regime. It's quite hard to say, but obviously I think the calculus inside the White House administration, the current one, was the maximum pressure and the sanctions would increase the resentment of ordinary people against the regime, and in so doing push for a change of that regime. But maybe it's not so simple. It's very hard to say from here. And what the new administration, what policy they will have on Iran is obviously another issue. I doubt they would have such a blunt policy, but it may not be a completely 360, 180 degree turn on that.
I know it's almost impossible to answer sort of crystal ball kind of questions, especially when it comes to Iran and the number of times this regime has been counted out and has somehow survived is notable. But, these protests have been crushed for now. There's no uprising for now, but the arrests and the feeling of repression is obviously still very much alive. In fact, the underlying reasons for this uprising, as we've been discussing over the course of these interviews, have not only not been resolved, they've deepened. I mean, the economy's gotten worse. The situation is dire. There's a pandemic, of course, on top of that now. Yeah. And we can expect, surely, the next time there's the equivalent of a gas price increase or a political decision that's deeply unpopular with the public, it's going to spark another round of uprising. And the next wave would likely be more violent, the crackdown more brutal. Where is all of this going?
Well, again, it's obviously it's hard to make a firm conclusion. As you say, it's very much dictated by outside events and unpredictable events. I think if you look at the shooting down of the Ukrainian airliner early this year, this is an event which is completely not predicted by anyone. Obviously, it happened, and that produced a protest in a certain time. But that's an example of the kind of event which can emerge from absolutely nowhere and suddenly transform a situation. I'm not going to stand here and I can't make any predictions over the future of the Iranian system and the Iranian regime. All I can say is that it's clear that the economic situation is extremely tough inside Iran, but it's true also that the system has now survived for decades through difficult times, and it's having lived there myself, I know it's a system which has quite deep roots inside Iranian society as well. So it's very hard to say, but obviously there are many factors which are changing inside Iran in terms of the demographics, the young population, and the increasing use of social media by people, which is something which you can't compare with from 10 years ago. That certainly changes things a lot. And as you say, it doesn't seem that the economic situation will get radically better in the short term. And since the Aban protests, the new factor is obviously the COVID pandemic. Although while at the start it looked like Iran was one of the countries, very much worst hit anywhere in the world, it has become more clear that it's much more of a global thing, and not just Iran that's hurt by it.
I just wonder, as a final question, I mean, even in the absence of what happens next, I mean, the $1 million question of who the opposition even is, since there's no unified opposition outside of Iran, let alone inside. But I just wonder if this is not building up to a crescendo. I mean, there is, as both Nazanin and Roshanak, who were on before you, mentioned that, that these protests were characterized by people, for example, on the streets of Iran saying "down with the dictator," "down with Khamenei," which, as you know, you wouldn't have heard 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And these campaigns by, say, the families of the victims of whether it's Pouya Bakhtiari or others of the Aban protests are not stopping, and the campaigns of the families of the Flight 752 and human rights organizations around people like Navid Afkari, it just seems like there is a growing global movement to shift something, and that seems inevitable. I know we've said that for a while, but what would your final word be on that?
I think my final word would be, and I think it's one of the key things about trying to understand Iran, is it's obviously an authoritarian system, but it's not a completely closed society, as you evoked in the question. Things are discussed, things are debated within restrictions in society. So one answer might be to watch how much space are the authorities prepared to give people as well. People are frustrated. There is anger. How much room will be given to them to give vent to that, ask questions of the authorities, and to bring them to account? And that might have an effect in the future on what happens if in fact people are allowed to give expression to what they want to say and get results from that within the system. But that is also another thing that people point out at the moment, is within the system you have the conservatives dominating what we used to be called, barely, much less these days. The reformist movement is much weakened. There's no obvious, in quotes, reformist figurehead. And so within Iran, if you are someone who wants change and you want to bring that out through the ballot box, when the elections are now looming as well, it's going to be harder to do that too, because of the weakness of the reformists, and you'll just be left with a choice of conservatives. So people might be left asking where they want to express themselves, whether the election actually offers them a chance to do that, and that can lead to tensions too. So it's definitely an absolutely critical time right now. Critical weeks even, because obviously the handover between the two administrations, who knows, there's obviously a lot of concern about what the Trump administration might do in its last weeks in office. That's another question, and then many questions about what policy the incoming administration will have towards Tehran, how much patience it's prepared to show. Will it be willing to quickly come back into the nuclear deal and help Iran thus economically, or will it want to keep on a much tougher line to keep good relations with the right in the US too? So many questions, and maybe we'll know a bit more in a few weeks' time, in a few months' time, when the handover between the two administrations has taken place. But it's certainly an absolutely critical moment in Iran's history. One could have said that at many moments over the last years. But I think that the upcoming months, this is going to be particularly true.
Stuart Williams, it's a great pleasure. I've enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for this.
Me too. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That is Stuart Williams, the international correspondent for Agence France-Presse. Stuart Williams joined us from Paris, France today. Back here with Captain Reza Gruvishaya and the fabulous Kayhan. I'm grateful to Nazanin Ansari, Stuart Williams, and Roshanak Astaraki for helping us out on the giving us context for Bloody November 1 year removed. You know, every time I do the interviews like that, I want to ask the question, so what can people in the diaspora do about it? And I catch myself not wanting to ask the question because it's kind of a futile. It's not that it's a futile question, but there's just only so many ways people can answer that question. It's like, well, self-determination for Iranians, we have to support as much as we can. We have to, but there's just there's only so much we can do. We just sit here and watch what goes down there and know that we have family and friends and loved ones there and worry about them and hope that things will change, right?
Yeah, it's just endless. I think the most important thing is we can't give up. We have to keep, holding each other solid and supporting each other despite all the atrocities that's going on over there. And what more can we do outside of Iran?
Shaya, what were you thinking of as you listened back to remembering Aban?
Yes. Actually, I thought with myself, the thing that pissed me off 10 years ago, now 11 years ago.
The Green Movement?
The Green Movement, but in November, we released a song related to that. All the killing happened and at that moment.
Dang Show did?
Yes, but the thing is really make me upset is that 10 years after, that song still works. And
it's more relevant.
More relevant. And not even in 10 years, when you listen to songs for 40 years ago, still it works now. And it shows that
an ongoing cycle.
Yes.
Yeah. The most devastating part. That's where we ask the question: are there lessons to be learned? What can we? And again, I think our three guests did their best job of trying to impart ideas around what the lessons can be. But there's only so much that can be said when it's a repeated cycle. And there's the one prediction is it's going to happen again. It's going to get worse. It's going to be more violent. It's going to be more a greater crackdown. It's going to be until something has to burst, right? I thought the point that I think Nazanin was making about the protesters getting younger and younger all the time was quite significant. Right? I thought that they were young in the Green Movement, so I guess.
Yes.
Reza, what were your thoughts as you?
Shaya, sort of in his own words, said the two only questions that were circling in my head: when would be the next uprising, and how much worse it's going to be, the crackdown, the violent essentially response from the regime to the people. And you're right, Nazanin said it quite nicely, that the protesters are keep getting younger and younger because they find no future, and they're hopeless, that there is no future for them in Iran.
What I found most heartbreaking during that time, I don't know if you remember, but last November I kept reopening every media outlet, CNN, BBC. Nobody was covering this. And if they were, very limited. It was maybe the third page over. That broke my heart.
Actually, let me tell you something about that I found really interesting. Just doing this kind of focus on this today, the difference between folks that I know who are have either still in Iran or they've just come from Iran and they're more focused on sort of Persian Twitter and what's going on in Persian media, Farsi media. We're like, Aban, yeah, everybody's talked about that. We already know all the details. Whereas for those of us who have been in the diaspora longer or are not consuming as much Persian media, or I watch CNN or read the New York Times or whatever, there really hasn't been that much information for us, right? Like a lot of this stuff is a learning curve, right, because it isn't covered in the global media. Was not. And I do believe it's important for us to do stuff like this in English, because it's got to become accessible to those who are not Farsi speaking, to first of all non-Iranians, but even Iranians who are not constantly still watching Persian media because they came here 2 years ago, or are sort of steeped in that. Mm-hmm. And there's so many in the diaspora, and of course non-Iranians, who need access to this information through English channels as well. Yeah, if not any other language that isn't Farsi. All right, this is Roqe. You are listening to us on SoundCloud, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Telegram. The Roqe team is here, and it's Monday, so that can only mean one thing. Each week, she enriches our lives by teaching us language we didn't know, at least some of us. And she completes us in our mission to be perfect English and Persian blended specimens. She's the person behind the popular Englisi Farsi Instagram page. But as importantly, she is the Persian priestess of proverbs, the Australian sage of sayings, the wondrous woman of words. She is Mona from Melbourne, our resident Roqe wordsmith. And she joins us right now from Melbourne.
Hello, salam. How are you all?
Durud.
Durud, yes, correct.
How is life down under?
Honestly, it's been really good. Spring's here, and I hear you guys are under a bit of a situation with COVID at the moment, so I very much feel for you guys, because we're doing really well. We're 30 days COVID-free in Melbourne, so wow. I can't complain about that, and I feel for you guys, because you're undergoing a second wave. Is that correct?
Well, more than undergoing.
Feels like the sixth wave.
Yeah. I guess Australia, Melbourne is the place to be. The sun's coming out. Spring is here.
Yeah.
No COVID. Good for you. What are you bestowing upon our imaginations today? A word, a saying, a proverb, an idiom? What is it?
Today is an idiom, and it's related. Yes, it's related to the humble grape.
The what?
The humble grape, or angur, as we like to call it.
The humble grape, okay.
So I have a bit of a backstory about it, and then we can go into the nitty-gritty of today's idiom.
All right.
Do we need a recap on what an idiom is, or do you feel our listeners?
I think you can always provide a recap on what an idiom is. Yes.
So an idiom is a group of words that have a meaning that's not actually explicitly stated in the sentence. So it has a non-literal meaning.
Okay.
So
I believe last week was an idiom.
Correct.
Right.
I've found that the idioms are quite interesting in Persian cultural context, and I find that they have an interesting backstory to a lot of them. So I thought I'd share this one with you all today.
Okay.
All right. So there's a famous poet. So it's said that one day Malik, I'm going to butcher this name. My mum made me practice it like 3 times, but I still think I'm going to butcher it. So please wish me luck. So his name is Malako Arye Bahar. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this famous poet.
Shaya currently is wearing a referee outfit, and he acts as the referee when it comes to words on this. So Shaya, can you please help us with the pronunciation of that?
Yes. Malik Sho'araye Bahar.
Wow.
To make it simple for you, Malik it means the sahib, owner. Sho'ara is the plural way of sha'ir, poets, and Bahar is the spring. Malik Sho'araye Bahar.
Bahar, yes, correct. Thank you. I told my mom, I practiced it, but I definitely didn't say it like that.
Can we just have your mom doing this instead of you? She in Melbourne?
Yes.
She can still be. Is her name Mona? Could she also be Mona from Melbourne? We could switch you.
Okay. Her name is Nuran, and she's currently taking care of my children, so I can chat to you.
Lovely. Okay. Thank you, Nuran. All right, go ahead.
Yes, very much. So whatever Shaya said, the poet Bahar, he was sitting in a meeting, and the audience had chosen 4 words to test his poetic prowess, so that he can bring them into a quatrain. So a quatrain is a poetry that is consisted of 4 lines that rhyme. So what they do is they give them 4 random words, and these proficient poets are able to weave these words into rhythmic sounds that are made up of 4 sentences. And so in order to do that and to prove his skills, the crowd
what era was this poet? Malik?
I
don't know.
I think 60 AD from memory. I mean, I read up about it.
Many centuries ago.
Yes, correct. A long time ago.
Okay.
And so they wanted to test his prowess, and so they gave him these 4 words. So they gave him the words khurus, angur, derafsh, which is flag, and sang, which is stone. And so they made him come up with this poem on the spot.
Khurus, angur, sang, and deracht, a tree.
Derafsh, which is a flag.
Derafsh. Derafsh. Okay.
Yes. So he made up this amazing poem, and the audience was stunned. But an inexperienced young man who was present in this gathering said that this was like all rigged and not actually an impromptu creation. And he said, if you really are such a wizard of words, I would like to give you 4 more words so that you can come up with these quatrain again with these new words.
So the guy in the audience said it was rigged.
Yeah, he totally. He said it was
his name. Was his name Donald J. Trump?
That wasn't specified in the story.
That was too long ago.
It was an anonymous young man.
Okay,
yes.
All right.
And the 4 words he came up with was mirror, so ayne, arre, which is saw, shu, which is kafsh, and gure, which is like a sour or unripe grape.
Okay.
And he asked the poet to weave these words into a quatrain, and obviously trying to make a mockery of this proficient and very well-versed, wise young poet. And obviously he could do this with the greatest of ease. And I don't know whether you want me to share this poem. I hope I can do it justice. Shaya, please.
Well, hang on a second. Now, just on the basis of what Mona has told us so far, Shaya and Reza, do you know where this is going? What the idiom is going to be? No. Okay. So far you stumped the experts, and
wow.
Keon and I are still trying to figure out what angur means. So don't. So we don't really stand a chance. Go ahead and so we've got these 4 words that the poet was going to be using, and then the 4 words that are suggested by the non-believer in the audience, and then so he forms a poem using all 8 words.
Yes, and he does it so eloquently, and he weaves it so cleverly that if you would like, I can share the poem and then share the idiom that goes along with it.
Okay, share the poem first, yeah.
Okay, so چون آینه نور خیز گشتی احسنت چون اره به خلاق تیز گشتی احسنت در کفش ادیبانه جهان کردی پایی قور نشده مویز گشتی احسنت. So essentially he weaved all of these 4 words in such an eloquent manner, but really he was schooling this young man who was trying to undermine his genius. So basically saying that he's too big for his boots. So can you guess the idiom that is evolving from this? Have you come across it before?
It doesn't involve shotor this week. I know that.
That's all I'm good for.
It doesn't involve mork or shotor.
Out.
Yeah. Or something to do with kafsh. I mean, you're too big for or angur. What?
Angur.
Angur.
So it's related to a gure, so the unripe grape. So can you think of any idioms that are related to a gure?
Gure. No, I wouldn't know the Farsi idiom, and I can't think of a English idiom that involves an unripe grape.
I don't think there's a word for gure.
Yeah. No,
Yes.
it's unripe grape. Yeah. Okay. So, now Shaya and Reza are looking devilishly self-satisfied. Like they know what the answer is.
Do you know?
Who wants to? Shaya, you want to tell us?
Yeah, actually, the last phrases that you just recited, you said the idiom that قوره نشدی قوره نشده مویز گشتی احسنت.
That's right.
Can you say that again, please? Now we have to figure out what. قوره نشده.
قوره نشده.
So, if the grape has not become unripe, no.
Okay.
So it's not
قوره نشده.
قوره نشده. It means you're not even on what's grape?
Unripe.
An unripe grape.
You're not even unripe grape, but you want to be raised.
That's good. That's good.
You haven't paid your dues
قوره
yet.
نشده, even though you're not even a ripe grape, you want to be what is it?
Maviz.
Sorry, no. Maviz.
Is another word for raisin.
Raisin.
It's like a currant, like a Zante currant. So it's a bit smaller than a raisin, but yeah, very similar family.
Okay, so Mona, do you give us the idiom again?
So قوره نشده مویز شده.
So if Kion's boasting about her Farsi, I can say ببین قوره نشده مویز شده.
مویز شده. Yes, exactly.
As in sit down, little girl. You have much to learn.
No, I like it. It's kind of like it's a nice imagery. It hasn't even become a ripe grape and wants to be a raisin
exactly.
It's quite poetic.
But you know what's funny?
Well,
I hadn't heard that idiom before, but I got it as soon as I heard it. I understood what it meant, but I never heard that before. So it's the first
How
time.
common is that, Mona?
Well, I couldn't tell you because I've never lived in Iran. So
Can you ask your mother?
she's heard it before. When I said it, she was like, "Oh yeah, I remember this one."
What about you, Shai? Do you know that one? Do you know that one? Hang on a second. Let's call Ponta the artist because she knows these things.
I have a correction, but Malikoshare Bahar is for 100 years ago, actually.
Oh, he's only 100 years ago.
Apologies.
Yeah,
okay. Well, I guess it was just something I'd read up on a long while ago. So thank you for correcting.
So Ponta, if you can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, so Mona from Melbourne is on the line right now, and she's taught us a new idiom, and I want to know if you know it. How would we test whether she knows it or not? Shaya, see if you can get Ponta to guess it.
Okay. مثلا Jian, he's teaching me some stuff about making a program. And one day I come to his office and I said, "No, you say it wrong. We have to do it on this way." And Jian would say to me, "Oh, you blah 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 blah."
What would I say? Oh, you're trying to be something you're not. What would be the Persian idiom for that?
You try to be something.
It's related to anguro.
And it's related using something to do with angur, kind of.
قوره نخورده مویز شدی.
Oh!
Wow, amazing. Go Ponta.
Ponta the artist. Although it's قوره نشده.
Something like that. But it's acceptable, I think.
Yeah, very good. Very good.
Definitely.
So,
I'll
Ponta,
take it.
how common is that? Do have people use that a lot?
Honestly, I use those kind of things a lot. But yeah.
Most people you think would know it.
Yes, most old generation people than now, I think.
Okay.
Than the new ones.
Super old people like you.
No. Oh, no.
Ponta's our youngest team member. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ponta the artist. Mona from Melbourne, you've done it again. You've created magic with words. Let me see if Kayhan can repeat it back because Kayhan's got to use it on her doctor and family.
God, you're putting pressure on me.
Come on, Kayhan.
قوره نشده مویز میخواد بشه.
Mavi.
That works.
That works, right? It works
Yeah.
in my head, so.
It carries the meaning still, definitely.
Mona Kiani, Mona from Melbourne, thank you so much for this, and see you next Monday.
Thanks, Jian. Thanks, team. Lovely to speak to you all. Take care.
Bye, Mona.
Bye, Mona.
That's Mona from Melbourne. You can find her page at Inglissi Farsi on Instagram. Thank you, the fabulous Kayhan. See you
Jian.
Thursday. Thank you, Captain Reza. Groovy Shaya.
Thank you.
Angur Nashode.
Naviz Nashia.
That's full time for Roqe for today. If you want to find out anything about our show or look at our previous episodes or link to any of our platforms, roqemedia.com, roqemedia.com, where you can also become a patron of our program and support us. Thanks to the amazing team who put this show together each week. Producer Susan, Ponce the artist, Thoughtful Negin, the fabulous Kayhan, Sabi Roham, Aghay Mehrdad, English Muhammad, Captain Reza, and Groovy Shaya. Thanks to all of you out there supporting us. Please subscribe if you've not done so already. You can find me on Instagram at Jian Ghomeshi. And of course, Mizun Bashin.